All right, let's now go across to our next guest. We are now joined by a former Indian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Meera Shankar. Ma'am, welcome back. Great to have you with us once again. We're looking back at the big takeaways from this historic 3-day visit that has just concluded. And of course, what is very interesting is that, President Biden described India and the US as two great friends, powers, and democracies, and said the India US ties will define the 21st century. And Prime Minister Modi has redefined AI. He says the future is AI, and that's America and India. Going by everything that we've seen in the last few days, ma'am, what are your thoughts on how this truly historic visit has panned out?
Well, I think it's been a very significant visit because you have some very significant concrete outcomes going beyond the very high protocol which was visible throughout the visit. And here I would focus on especially three agreements. There are a range of agreements because the relationship is so broad-based, but I would focus on three. One is that for the first time, you have an agreement for defense manufacturing in India between a US company and an Indian company. The GEF 414 jet engine will now be manufactured in India along with HAL with significant transfer of technology. Now, this is a first because till now there were hesitations in the US about transfer of technology to India and actually getting defense manufacturing off the ground. So this is a significant first. And I do hope that it's not a one-off, but will be the start of a much broader collaboration between the two countries, which will help to establish a defense industrial base in India. Now, this GE F-14 engine is going to power the Tejas Mark II aircraft, which is still on the drawing board in India. So it is something which is going to bring the two countries together into the future. It's an important deal. The second is this whole initiative on critical and emerging technologies, which brings together not just business on both sides, but also research institutions and universities to create an ecosystem of collaboration in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, telecommunications, and space. Now, this is a framework, but it's a clear strategic signal as well. It'll depend on how far we are able to actually concretize projects and proposals under this framework. The first step is the investment by Micron in India to set up a testing and assembly plant for semiconductors. The first significant shift in terms of high-tech manufacturing in telecommunications was the Apple Foxconn shifting part of their manufacturing to India for mobile phones. That has been quite successful. It has actually now undertaken significant exports from India. But that's only a first step. And I do hope that we are able to, expand on this and that the Micron investment will be the start of greater collaborations between Indian and US companies in these sectors. The third element is space, where we have signed the Artemis Accord with the US, and we are going to collaborate in manned space flight. The US will train our astronauts. And I think they're showing ambition in proposing that perhaps they will be ready to put an Indian astronaut on the International Space Station as early as next sometime towards the latter half of next year. So that's a pretty ambitious project. Looking beyond this, I would say that there are huge opportunities in the trade and investment space, and both countries have agreed to try to iron out some of the issues in the trade relationship. And I do hope that there will be greater liberalization and streamlining of the visa process in India, which has been extremely, cumbersome and with long delays. So all
Absolutely.
in all, a very significant visit.
A very significant visit marked by some epoch making deals. And you're right, H-1B visa rules, we are told, are in fact being changed as part of a pilot project, and that is expected to make life easier for a considerable number of Indians who work in the United States. Let's hope that the wait time for visas in general is reduced. The two sides have also decided to terminate 6 outstanding disputes at the World Trade Organization. And, talking about the investments that are being made, what I also find interesting is that while you have Micron, that's going to set up this major semiconductor facility in India, the first of its kind in this country, that would involve a huge investment. And Google plans to open its global fintech operations center in Gujarat. That would involve an investment of $10 billion in India's digitization fund, as been announced by the CEO Sundar Pichai. And equally interesting is the fact, ma'am, that Indian solar panel maker Vikram Solar Limited has announced it's going to invest $1.5 billion in the US solar energy supply chain. So we're not looking at a one-way street here. There are investments being made by companies from both countries, in each other's territories. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's already substantial, presence of Indian companies across all 50 American states.
Yes, I think Indian companies have invested around $40 billion in the United States in recent years. And such as, for instance, the Tata order for a huge number of planes from Boeing. I think this will power a lot of jobs and manufacturing within the US as well.
Yes, absolutely, ma'am. That is exactly the hope. The Prime Minister, in fact, has also talked about how the India-US relationship is, about make in India and make for the world. He said together, the US and India are not just forming policies, we are shaping lives, dreams, and destinies. Be it convergence on global issues or tech transfer, both countries are taking strong steps for a better future. Clearly, a lot has been said over the years about how these are natural partners, because we're talking about the oldest democracy in the world and the largest democracy in the world. But clearly, this relationship has now gone way beyond those cliches, if I may put it that way. We may not be allies, because India insists on maintaining its strategic autonomy. But this is definitely a new partnership that could well define the 21st century. And especially if you look at the whole gamut of issues that have been touched upon during this visit, there isn't a single area of bilateral cooperation that wasn't woven into the discussions that have taken place during this visit.
Yes, if you look at the joint statement, it's indeed exhaustive, covering, science and technology cooperation, covering cooperation in education, cooperation in energy, particularly renewable energy. I mean, it's a whole range of issues that the two countries actually collaborate on, including agriculture and health. So it's not just, defined by any one issue, though the driving factor right now is the convergence of interests in shaping a sustainable balance in the Indo-Pacific and not allowing any one country to have, dominant or hegemonic status in this region. So I think that is the driving force, but the relationship is very, very broad-based.
Absolutely. Let's now talk about these two countries that obviously, have a bearing on India-US ties, Russia and China. Of course, it's another matter that there are some incredibly dramatic developments taking place in Russia today as we speak. But, when you look at some of the key deals that have been signed between India and the United States, the defense deals especially, there is, of course, a school of thought that the US has been very keen to wean India off its heavy dependence on Russia for weapon supplies. And by opening the doors of transfer of technology for India for the very first time, the US has taken a huge step in that direction. Is that something that you would agree with, ma'am? And then, of course, we're going to talk in detail about China.
I think that, Russia also understands that India tries to build its own capabilities from whatever source it finds the most appropriate. And if we are getting access to higher technology or to more advanced levels of technology with, a capacity to absorb that technology and manufacture in India, it's part of our priorities. It's not aimed against Russia. And, we have bought planes from Russia, which we are manufacturing in India. We have bought anti-missile systems, the SAMs from Russia. Not anti-missile system, surface-to-air missiles, sorry, from Russia. So there's a whole range of things which we buy and continue to buy from Russia. But clearly, this is an opportunity to substantially advance the capabilities of the Indian forces, particularly the Air Force, and our own defense industrial manufacturing base. And therefore, it is something which we will decide based on what we feel is the most suitable for us.
Absolutely. And when you talk about the Predator drone deal, a lot has been said about how these drones are going to significantly enhance India's surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence capabilities, as well as strike capabilities along its land borders with Pakistan and China. Talking about China, the Prime Minister, without naming anybody, said in his address to the US Congress that the dark clouds of coercion and confrontation are casting their shadow in the Indo-Pacific. The stability of the region has become one of the central concerns of the India-US partnership. We share a vision of a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific that is free from domination. We've also seen that controversy over President Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator soon after Antony Blinken's visit to Beijing over the weekend. How significant do you think, ma'am, the China factor is in the India-US relationship today? Yes, this is a relationship that is independent of any external factors. It does stand on its own in many ways, but we cannot dispute the fact that China's growing aggression and expansionism is a matter of concern for India, for the United States, and perhaps for the international community at large.
Certainly, I think China's increasingly aggressive behavior on territorial issues, whether it is in the maritime boundary with regard to the South China and East China Sea, or on the land boundary with India, is a cause of concern to its neighbors. And this is a factor. The challenge posed by China, how to manage it, is clearly a factor in the India-US relationship, though not the only factor by any means. Also, I think both countries seek to avoid conflict with China. And I think that's important because US also says that it will compete with China vigorously, it will cooperate with China where it can, and at the same time, it will seek to avoid conflict with China, even though it calls China the one country with both the intention and the capability to pose a challenge to the US in the medium to long term. India, too, would like to be able to build its capabilities to deter Chinese adventurism on its border. But at the same time, it does not seek to provoke a conflict with China and is engaged in dialogue with China on resolving the issue of Chinese encroachments on the border. We've, managed to reach agreement on some of these issues, but several still remain outstanding, and progress has been slow. We've also conveyed to China that if we are unable to restore the status quo in these areas or reach agreement to de-escalate the situation in ways with which both countries are comfortable, then it can't be business as usual in the relationship, because you can't have this lack of trust. You can't have this suspicion and at the same time, grow the relationship as though everything was normal.
Right. Ma'am, I'd like to discuss another issue with you. We've seen over the last couple of days a controversy that was stoked by former US President Barack Obama, who in his interview to CNN said, if I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, I would argue that if you do not protect the rights of minorities in India, there's a strong possibility that at some point India starts pulling apart. He suggested President Biden must raise this with Prime Minister Modi. Of course, this is an issue that came up even during the press conference that was addressed by the two leaders after their bilateral talks. The Prime Minister was asked what his government plans to do for minority rights in the country. And we saw what he said. He said there is no question of there being any kind of discrimination in India. We are, a democracy. We have a constitution that we abide by. But how do you think the two sides have handled this rather prickly issue? Needless to say, President Obama's comments have sort of stirred anger in some sections here in India, while there are those who say that President Biden has chosen to take a much more pragmatic stand on this issue, because he said, democracy is in American DNA and it's in the Indian DNA as well. What do you think?
I think the Biden administration has sought to handle these issues somewhat delicately and pragmatically. I think there's a section of liberal opinion in the US, both in the media and in the Congress, which is very concerned about some of these issues and has expressed it publicly. But the Biden administration, and I think for any administration, I think these are complex choices. And the Biden administration has chosen to downplay these issues in public and to prioritize actually building a strong strategic partnership with India. And I think that is their policy, because in public, they have chosen to avoid pointing fingers at India. And even when they discuss these issues, they always talk about them in a way that democracy is facing challenges and there's work to be done, mutually and by all countries to reinforce democracy.
Right. Also, ma'am, before we let you go, you've been a career diplomat, you've been India's ambassador to the United States, you have seen many presidents and prime ministers over the years. A lot has been said about the the personal rapport that Prime Minister Modi and President Biden have built over the years. They've actually met multiple times in recent years. The president even reminded Prime Minister Modi of how he had hosted him at a luncheon when he was the vice president, and their relationship goes back many years. We've seen some warm hugs being exchanged as well during this visit and previously. How important do you believe personal chemistry really is between any two leaders when it comes to shaping ties between their two countries? Is personal chemistry an important element of foreign policy?
Let me say it helps at the margins. Relations between countries are driven by the interests of those countries. Personal relationships between leaders can influence at the margin, but I don't think they can change the course of the relationship. Those will be driven by larger factors and national interests.
Fair enough. We'll leave it at that. Ambassador Meera Shankar, thank you so much for joining us, ma'am, and sharing your perspective with us on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's historic 3-day visit that has now concluded.